And who was Jefferson's running mate? Say that louder.
Aaron Burr.
Aaron Burr. Now, even though, again, we still have the same system, they thought they had sort of figured something out between here and here. And what they figured out was, okay, everybody, now remember, these guys are getting elected. How are they elected? How are they still elected? The Electoral College, right? So the people vote, but then the electors have to cast their votes. So it was decided that within the parties, which had started to emerge, that the electors who are going to vote for Adams, let's say you had, I don't know what the number is, but let's say you had 60 electors who were going to vote for Adams. 60 of them would vote for Adams. So you'd have 60 here. How many would vote for Pinckney? How many of these electors would vote for Pinckney? Because they cast 2 votes. 59. Why?
There can't be 2 people in first place.
Yeah, you don't want them to tie, right? So all of the electors would cast their votes for Adams. The other ones would, everybody else would cast their vote for Pinckney except for 1 vote. And then there would be some random person, like let's say John Jay, and you'd give him 1 vote. Now over here, let's say you've got 70 electoral votes. Same thing's supposed to happen. These guys are all going to vote for Jefferson. It should be 69 and somebody, whoever, should get 1. Just because you don't want the tie, because you want Jefferson to come in first, Burr to come in second, because that makes him Jefferson's vice president. And then these guys are behind. So they're not going to, be elected. Is this what happened? Who won the election? Who won the election? It was a tie. Nobody won because these guys didn't do it right. These guys did this. Now, what should Burr have done since everybody understood that Burr was the running mate, that he was supposed to be vice president? Probably just conceded and gave it to Jefferson. I don't even know if legally you're allowed to do that, but if he had publicly done that, it probably would have happened. But instead, he said, no, I think I might want to be president, which is a total betrayal of Jefferson. So what happens? If you're tied and there's not a clear winner of the presidency, what do you have to do?
Goes to the House of Representatives.
Goes to the House of Representatives, and they get to determine who's going to be president out of these 2 men. Now, since we all know that Aaron Burr was never president, we know who they chose, right? But they didn't choose him on the first vote. They had to do 36 ballots before they finally decided that Jefferson would be the next president. Which obviously now means these 2 guys aren't going to get along very well. Because Burr has pretty much stabbed him in the back and tried to take his job from him. So because of this situation, what did we do?
The 12th Amendment, that there's 2 ballots.
12th Amendment changed the way we do this, and we said, oops, let's try this a different way. Let's have separate ballots for president and vice president. So now you actually run for the vice presidency. And you don't get to be president unless you kill the president after you've been elected, and then you get to step into his role. Does that make sense? So we had 2 of these elections that were kind of weird. The first one, you end up with the opposing party as your vice president. The second one, you end up with your running mate competing with you to become president. And then they said, this system just isn't working too well. Let's change this so that these guys are running on separate tickets completely. Especially since by here we pretty much have established parties. We do have the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Now, this is the election of 1800. It's also been referred to as the Revolution of 1800. Did you know we had a revolution in 1800? Why is it called that? Matt?
Because of the first party shift we had, well, party shift that we had in the American history.
Because the Federalists had been in power for 12 years under Washington and Adams. And now you're going to have the Democratic Republicans, or the Republicans as your book calls them, take over under Jefferson. Is that a big deal?
They thought it would be. It's not as big of a deal as you would have liked.
Depends. I mean, today we do this all the time, right? You guys we're all pretty young, but what happened in 2000? So Clinton had been president. Gore was running for the presidency against Bush. So Clinton had been president for 8 years as a Democrat. Gore runs against Bush. Who won? Who won? Do we really know? I'm still not sure we really know.
All because of this thing right here.
But, you know, Gore won the popular vote, right? He actually had more votes in the country than Bush. But because we, in Florida, screwed up the vote, and they had to do the whole, I mean, it was a mess, you know. If you guys remember that in terms of what they had to do. So Bush ends up winning the election. Now, that particular election was very intense, and there was a lot of high emotion because a lot of people, even to this day, still feel that Gore was cheated out of the presidency because they don't feel that Bush should have been able to become president. But how many people died in the streets because of that election?
0.
I don't know of any. I mean, I'm assuming there were a few bloody noses in bars. You know, people got a little intense about things. But my point being, we can switch from Republican to Democrat or Democrat to Republican in this country today, and we just take that for granted. We assume that that's going to happen on occasion, and we may not be happy about it with the way it happened with Gore and Bush. You know, a lot of people were very upset about that election. And a lot of people began to call for getting rid of the Electoral College and saying, why shouldn't it just be popular vote? If Gore had more popular votes in this country, why is he not president? What's the purpose of the Electoral College? Well, why can't we just do it based on popular vote? Why can't we just count all the votes in Florida, and if, they get some, you just count all Florida, count all the other states, add them together, and whoever gets the highest number of votes, why can't they become president?
Southern states are usually Republican, and they got more people than a lot of northern states do. They're bigger.
Well, people may not like it, but what is the problem? I don't know that there is one, but what is the problem of just letting the people truly decide who's going to be president? Well, we laugh, but in all honesty, that is the main reason why they created the Electoral College. Because they wanted something between the people and the actual person who ended up sitting in office to be able to say, well, if the people really acted in a stupid way, these educated people who are the electors can reverse that. They can decide, well, we're not going to go with what the people said. Now, in a lot of states today, the electors have no choice. They have to cast their vote the way the people in the state voted, but not all states are like that. In some states, even if the people 100% voted for the Republican, if the electors don't like that, they can cast their vote for the Democrat. It never happens, but they could. But that was the main reason why they created the Electoral College. They wanted that buffer so that the people, if they screwed up, if the people were too stupid to know what was best for them, then these educated elite could fix it. So after the 2000 election, a lot of them started saying, well, why do we need the Electoral College? Why can't we trust the people to make the decision and get what they really have voted for? Now, that's a whole other story, which we don't need to get into right now. But this is why they called this the Revolution of 1800, because you basically had one party, in a sense, get thrown out and was replaced by another party. It's like a complete change of the government in a way, because you're throwing out the ruling party and you're replacing it. And at this point in time, they weren't sure if the people of America would accept this. Would there be a revolt? Would there be a rebellion that would take place? Or would people say, okay, we might not be happy about this, but in 4 years we get a chance to run against them again and maybe get it back. That's what we do today. With all the people that were upset in 2000, there weren't revolts in the street, there weren't rebellions. There was just determination that in 2004 we're going to come back and we're going to get the office back. Didn't work, but that's what they said. That's pretty amazing, because it doesn't work that way in most countries of the world. We take it for granted. People wake up in the morning the day after the election, and some of them just forget there was even an election. And then all of a sudden, they see a newspaper headline, oh yeah, there was an election. Who won? It's like, we don't assume that there's going to be any major reaction. We don't assume that we have to be careful when we step out our door the morning after an election because somebody might shoot us, or there might be shooting going on in the streets. That's what a lot of people deal with in their countries. And we just assume this is the natural way things work. This is why, I mean, even if you don't like a lot of things about this country, which, you know, after you have my class, you usually find out all the things you shouldn't like. But even if you don't like a lot of things about this country, this is amazing that we have been doing this for over 200 years, and we're still doing it. And we don't have riots in the streets because of this. We just have people that get frustrated and upset and, you know, go to the bar and have a few drinks and bitch about it with their neighbors, but we don't take to, you know, guns to the White House or something like that. Now, I don't know if that's good or bad in the sense that I think a lot of us have become very apathetic and we don't care. Maybe we should have a little bit more people upset when things like this happen. But this is what Jefferson called the Revolution of 1800. Because he was saying it's like one party has been replaced by another, and yet it's a peaceful revolution. And nobody was really sure it could happen that way back in 1800. We take it for granted. They weren't so sure.
Even though it's the people who decided. They knew it was coming.
Well, it's kind of, you know, just because people vote a particular way, they may not necessarily, they may think everybody else is going to vote like them, and then you go and you actually count the votes and you find out, no, maybe people aren't on the same page as me, and the other party gets into office. You know, people can get upset about things like that. Anyway, that's kind of the end of chapter 6, but moving into chapter 7, at the beginning of chapter 7, it talks about Jefferson doing his inaugural address and how he could have stood up and been like, you know, damn those Federalists, let's get them all out of office, they're a bunch of cheaters and, you know, corrupt people, but he didn't do that. He stood up in his inaugural address, whether he meant it or not. He stood up and he said, we're all Federalists. We're all Republicans. We're all Americans. You know, we're all in this together. Let's make this a better country from this point forward. It doesn't matter if I'm of a political persuasion that's different than yours. You know, I want to be able to lead all of you. And what he said, again, whether he meant all of it or not, what he said publicly was exactly what the country needed to hear, because they needed to feel that he wasn't going to just be the president for those people who voted for him. Now, Republicans ended up being in power for the next 24 years, so they had a bit of a hold on the government for a while. But part of that is the Federalists' fault in the way they handled things, because they kind of disgraced themselves in some different ways that are talked about in this chapter. But we'll get back to that. In terms of your notes on this chapter, I mean, we definitely don't have time to go into everything that's here, but there's about 3 or 4 things that I want to make sure we touch on. The first is shortly after Jefferson took office, we had an issue having to do with the court system. And how many of you have had government, American national government? A few of you. This is probably one of the, some people might argue, the most important court case in the history of our country. Because what happens based on this decision is going to affect the role that the Supreme Court or that the judiciary system in general is going to have, the power it's going to have in the country from this point forward. Up until this point, which is only about 10 years that the government has been in operation, the Supreme Court was, people didn't really understand exactly what role it was supposed to play. And it wasn't looked at with the kind of prestige and honor and power that we think of it today. It was just kind of like, well, we don't really know what these guys are supposed to be doing. There were 5 justices plus a chief justice, so there were 6 members on the court. They didn't even know when they should meet, why they should meet, what exactly they should do when they did meet. A lot of times when they did meet, they didn't all meet. People went off and did other things. And it was a very confusing group of people in terms of what exactly they were supposed to be doing. In 1800, with the election of 1800, as we move into 1801, John Marshall moves from being Secretary of State under Adams to being the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So in the transition from Adams to Jefferson, he is no longer Secretary of State because obviously Jefferson gets to choose his own cabinet. And he is appointed as the Supreme Court Chief Justice. So in 1801, he takes over as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. But this case is going to be the first case that he's going to be presiding over. And the decision that that court makes under John Marshall is going to dictate the character of the Supreme Court from then till this day. So it's huge in terms of what role is this court supposed to be playing in our country. And this isn't very long, but I want to show you this.
Marbury versus Madison began with another breathtaking act of partisanship by the outgoing President John Adams.
All right, hang on. Let me just pause that for a second. Let me catch up. The case, Marbury versus Madison, Marbury, at the end of Adams' presidency, he had appointed a whole bunch of new judges. And the reason why he was doing that is he was trying to gain control for the Federalists of the judicial branch of government. If you appoint a whole bunch more judges, then you've got, obviously, a majority of those judges are going to be Federalists.
I just had a question. Before judicial review was established, did they really have a point in the checks and balances, or were they just kind of floundering around?
Basically floundering. That's kind of the key, is that they were, we created a judicial branch, but we didn't really define very clearly what exactly their role would be and how much of a role they would have in terms of the legislative and the executive branch. They definitely were not seen as equal to either one of those. And this case, with the decision, as you just called it, being the concept of judicial review, kind of brings them up to that point of equality with the other two branches. And that's really the essence of this case. But Adams had appointed all of these judges, but in order for their appointment to be considered official, they have to actually receive their appointment. It has to be delivered to them. And these are obviously back then written out, and they're sealed with a presidential seal and all that kind of stuff. 17 of those were not delivered before Adams was no longer president. He's doing these on the last day that he's president, but there were 17 that were left in the office and had not been delivered. It was assumed that the new Secretary of State, because it was his job to do that, the new Secretary of State would deliver those. But when Jefferson and Madison, who was his Secretary of State, when they took over, they said, we're just not going to deliver them. And we'll appoint our own judges to those 17 positions. Now, there were a lot more than that were delivered, but there were these 17 that were not. Marbury's was one of those 17. And he sued, saying that it's the responsibility of the Secretary of State to deliver my commission to me. And he was trying to get the court to force Madison, the new Secretary of State, to deliver his commission so he could take over as a federal judge. That's why he's suing. That's why it's Marbury versus Madison, because Marbury's the one who wants the judgeship. Madison is the Secretary of State, that it would normally be his responsibility to deliver the appointment. All right, let's see if this...
Marbury versus Madison began with another breathtaking act of partisanship by the outgoing President John Adams. Just weeks before Jefferson's inauguration, the lame duck Federalist Congress had passed legislation swelling the federal courts, and Adams stuffed them full of anti-Jeffersonians.
At the very end, literally the last day of Adams' presidency, he was busy signing commissions for these federal judgeships, including these justices of the peace. And the hour got very late, and he had to get the commissions signed, and then they were sent over to the Secretary of State, who happened to be John Marshall. And Marshall had to put the seal of the United States on it, and then they were to be delivered to these designated justices of the peace.
John Marshall knows he can't deliver them all. He gives about half of them to his brother James to deliver. James doesn't get around to delivering them before time runs out. The key lesson of Marbury versus Madison is don't give important documents to your brother.
When Thomas Jefferson arrived at the executive offices, 17 commissions sat signed, sealed, and undelivered. He directed his new Secretary of State, James Madison, to leave them ready. 10 months later, a would-be Justice of the Peace named William Marbury showed up at the Supreme Court, asking Marshall and his brethren to compel Madison to deliver his commission. John Marshall ordered Madison to show just cause for withholding Marbury's commission. Madison didn't feel obliged to bow to the court. He simply didn't answer. But when word of Marshall's demand spread through the Capitol, the Jeffersonians in Congress were not so passive.
Congress passes a law that basically closes down the Supreme Court for a full term. They just cancel the term by statute. And there's nothing in the Constitution that says they can't do that specifically. On the other hand, it's a pretty aggressive attack on the court.
There was the real feeling on the part of the justices that their days were numbered. And Marshall himself, I think, felt under considerable threat of impeachment.
The court was in its congressionally enforced recess for 14 months, while the Jeffersonians threatened to dismantle the entire Adams-built judiciary. Marshall stayed home in Richmond, Virginia with his wife Polly and their 6 children, puzzling out his next move in Marbury versus Madison. He didn't have a lot of good options.
If he backed down, if he was seen to back down, the court would lose all prestige. It would take generations for the court to recover from that act of cowardice. On the other hand, Marshall bravely gave an order to President Jefferson command the Secretary of State to convey the commission, the administration would disobey the appeal.
It's a weird way to end the video.
Well, I think there's 17 seconds left.
Yeah.
Conduct was
attention to the court order. And in that case, the Supreme Court of the United States would be a laughing stock.
Marshall doesn't want to have that situation because then the court looks powerless, and it sets a precedent that the court doesn't have to be obeyed.
All right, that sets up the situation. So what does the court end up deciding?
They don't have Congress didn't have the power to tell them that they could tell somebody to give the commissions.
Congress does not have the power to compel or to order Madison to deliver the commissions. Why does Congress not have that authority?
It's not the Constitution.
Well,
That power is left up to the judiciary.
say that again?
That power is left up to the judiciary branch. It's checks and balances.
Well, why did Marbury's not stupid, he's going to be a federal judge. Why did Marbury feel that the Congress did have the power to compel Madison to do that? No? It's not just implied.
So the Act of 1789 said they could do it.
Yeah, see, that's the problem. In the Judicial Act of 1789, which originally set up the federal court system, it actually did say in there that these officials, public officials, can be compelled to carry out their duties, whatever those duties might be, that they can be compelled to do that. What the court decided in this case, in Marbury versus Madison, is that particular law that had been passed, that law was unconstitutional, that it overstepped the boundaries that had been laid out for these different branches of government. And what they were doing is they, for the first time in our history, in 1801 or whatever, were declaring a law passed by Congress to be unconstitutional. So you've got the original Judiciary Act of 1789 that had a whole bunch of different points in it. You know, that this is actually what created the court system, the federal court system. But one of these things, they said it should never have been in there in the first place. Because in passing this law, that one aspect of the law was unconstitutional. The Congress had gone too far. So therefore, if that particular statement that said that they could compel people to do things, if that's unconstitutional, then the court can't force Madison to deliver the commission to Marbury. Now, the court could have just said, sorry, Marbury, you don't get the commission. End of story. Could have been seen as backing down, could have been seen as them just rubber stamping, you know, what Jefferson had already said, which is kind of the same thing. But it wouldn't have been an important case. None of us would be standing here or sitting here today talking about Marbury versus Madison. It would have been like a big deal. Probably there wouldn't even be a Supreme Court anymore because, you know, why did we need them? The whole point of this, it doesn't really matter about William Marbury. I mean, we don't care that he went home and shot himself in the head because he didn't get his judgeship.
Did he really?
I don't know, but, you know, it sounds good. Wow. I mean, personally, it really isn't about Marbury. It's not about whether or not he did or did not get his judgeship. That's not even the important part of the case. The important part of the case is they went well beyond I mean, you talk about going beyond the authority you've been given. In this decision, the Supreme Court did something that nobody had ever decided whose responsibility it was to do, which was,
Judicial review, who said what laws were constitutional.
yeah, the Supreme Court said, we're going to be the body who gets to decide what laws are or are not constitutional. That's not spelled out anywhere. They just claimed it. They claimed the power to do that. And the interesting thing is, nobody objected. Jefferson's not going to object because they're deciding in his favor, right? They're doing what he wanted to do, which is not have to deliver those commissions. And the Federalists didn't put up a fight. I mean, you guys ever done that kind of thing? Like you're trying to make a decision with somebody or something, and you know that you're doing something that the other person should object to, but they don't quite catch it? I mean, kids do that all the time with parents, but we do it with you guys too, you know. But you know in your mind that this person should be saying, wait a minute, I'm not going to do that. And they don't do it, and you're kind of like, oh, got that one in there. But that's exactly what the court's doing here. They're making a decision that goes well beyond this little case of Marbury versus Madison. They're making a decision that can set the precedent for this country, and it does, for the next 200 years, and nobody says anything. Nobody thinks that, wait a minute, I'll give up Marbury just so I don't have to deal with this other thing that they're creating for themselves. But this is an amazing power that they claim, because they now get to sit in the seat to say, wait a minute, Congress, that law that you passed 10 years ago, that's not constitutional. We need to get rid of that thing. They are the only body in this country that gets to make those kinds of decisions. And the scary thing is, once they're appointed to the Supreme Court, how long are they there? Until they die. And nobody's really figured out yet how to kill them. They're old too. Sometimes that's part of the problem. But I mean, seriously, in a way it's good, because the fact that they do get to sit there for life means that there's not a lot of this political angling and stuff. Because once they're there, it's not like, well, in 2 years we know they're going to be gone, so we can just replace them with somebody we want. Once they're there, they're going to be there until they die, or they decide to step down. But on the other hand, if you get people in there, maybe that the power goes to their head, or they're not really good judges, then how do you get rid of them? You have to impeach them, basically, which we've not ever done. But this case is extremely important because it really does put the Supreme Court at the same level as the executive and legislative branches. Now they're a power to be contended with. Now that may not have been true if over the next few years they had blundered and made stupid decisions and hadn't really done their jobs. But as I just said, John Marshall just became Chief Justice in 1801. How long will he be Chief Justice? Isn't he still on the court? 34 years he will be the Chief Justice of that court. And what he did with Marbury versus Madison is just the beginning. Because the decisions that will be made by that court, and basically, in a sense, made by John Marshall, because he's obviously the leader of that court, are going to show that this court is going to have to be contended with. They are not going to be submissive to the other two parties or to any other branch of the government. Now, I'm sure you won't be as impressed with this as I am, but this article came out in 2005, written by George Will, who was probably one of the more intelligent political analysts that this country has ever known. And it's called Midwife to Birth of a Nation. I'll read this, but I'll let you guys follow along as I read. A nation's identity consists of braided memories which are nourished by diligence and civic commemorations. It is therefore disappointing that at this moment of keen interest in the Supreme Court in the office of Chief Justice, that scant attention has been paid to the 250th anniversary of the birth of the nation's greatest jurist, Chief Justice John Marshall. So this is the 250th anniversary of John Marshall's birth in 2005. The oldest of the family's 15 children, he was born September 24, 1755, into Virginia rusticity, where women pinned their blouses with thorns. Yet he developed the most urbane and subtle mind of that era of remarkable statecraft. He was a member of Virginia's ratifying convention, and in nearly 35 years as Chief Justice, he founded American constitutional law. That kind of legal reasoning by Supreme Court justices is a continuous exegesis of the Constitution and is sometimes not easily distinguished from a continuing writing of the document. Everybody know what exegesis means? It's a term that's used often in interpreting Scripture, that when you read the Scripture, you try to, it's a Greek word that basically means like pull out the true meaning of it. And so what the Supreme Court is supposed to do is just that, to read the Constitution, to interpret it, to try to pull out what the intent was of the original founders and then apply it to our given situation today. But that last statement says it's not easily distinguished from a continuing writing of the document. And that's the thing about our Constitution. Some of the stuff that they said back when they wrote it doesn't apply exactly today, but you have to figure out how to take the meaning of it and apply it to your current situation. And in a sense, that can almost seem like you're rewriting the Constitution or you're adding to the Constitution. And there's a fine line there in terms of what's appropriate and what's not. I like what he says here in this next statement. Marshall is the most important American never to have been president. Because of his shaping effect on the soft wax of the young republic, his historic importance is greater than that of all but two presidents, Washington and Lincoln. Without Marshall's landmark opinions defining the national government's powers, the government Washington founded might not have acquired competencies, and society might not have developed the economic sinews sufficient to enable Lincoln to preserve the Union. Article 1, Section 8 enumerates Congress's powers and then empowers Congress to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. Marshall's capacious construction of the necessary and proper clause shaped the law and the nation's consciousness of itself. When in 1801 Marshall was nominated to be Chief Justice, one of the last things and much the best thing President John Adams did, the nation still largely had an Articles of Confederation mentality. Formally, it was a nation. Emotionally, hence actually, it was still in many ways many countries, most states being older than and more warmly embraced than the nation. Marshall's jurisprudence built the bridge to 1862, the year it became clear that many men would have to die in a protracted conflict to preserve the Union, and that many would be willing to do so. Marshall had been willing to die to help midwife the nation's birth, seeing much hard action during the Revolutionary War. Amiably sociable and broadly tolerant, he had friends of vastly different political persuasions, and the only adversary he seems to have steadily disliked was a second cousin named Thomas Jefferson. In part because of Jefferson's partisans' criticisms of Washington, whom Marshall celebrated in an immense biography as a symbol of a national identity transcending state loyalties. Among the many recent fine biographies of America's founders, none is finer than Jean Edward Smith, John Marshall, Definer of a Nation. Smith locates Marshall's greatness in this fact. Unlike Britain's constitutional documents, which are political documents, that it is Parliament's prerogative to construe, the U.S. Constitution is a legal document construed by courts, not by Congress. When judicial supervision of our democracy seems tiresome, consider the alternative. Marshall's life of strong, consequential prose had, Smith writes, a poetic coda. Marshall died in Philadelphia, birthplace of the Constitution, into which he breathed so much strength and meaning. The Liberty Bell, while tolling his death, cracked, and it never rang again. So when he died, they rang the Liberty Bell, which is a typical thing back in that time period, and it cracked, like to say, end of, the founding fathers. It's time to move into a new period of our history. But this guy is amazing in terms of molding the country. I mean, everything that George Will said, I agree with 100%. I mean, as far as a guy who's was never president, that never had that kind of public persona, so to speak, as far as, being out there in the public eye as much, he definitely had more to do with shaping this country than probably anybody else that we've ever known. But the case that we just talked about, what's the importance of it? In 2 words. Judicial review. That's what you need to remember about Marbury versus Madison. And what judicial review means is that the Supreme Court is the one, they're the body that reviews laws to determine whether or not they're constitutional. And they're the only entity that's allowed to do that. I mean, we can all look at it and say, I don't think that's constitutional, but nobody cares what we think. When they decide that something's not constitutional, the law goes away. Okay, so that's the key to Marbury versus Madison. Second piece in terms of Jefferson's presidency. Did our country expand during Jefferson's presidency, geographically?
Yes.
How so? What?
Louisiana Purchase.
The Louisiana Purchase. How come I have no lamp? Okay, green, I know you can't see it all yet, but green is country before Louisiana Purchase. Yellow is country, yellow and green is country after Louisiana Purchase. Okay, come on, let me do this. What do you know about that?
Is it technically illegal?
Hey. No. Hey. There you go.
Now what is that, how would you describe that? What did the Louisiana Purchase do for our country?
Doubled our land.
Pretty much doubled the amount of our territory. And how did we get it?
Bought it from Napoleon.
We bought it from Napoleon. And what was Jefferson's problem with this purchase?
It wasn't non-constitutional.
He didn't think it was constitutional. He didn't think he had the authority, just like he didn't think Hamilton had the authority to create a bank. He didn't think he had the authority to just go out and purchase this much territory for the country. Now, he got over it because it was such a great deal. I mean, everybody's telling him, Tom, come on, buddy, don't be stupid. This is the best deal you're ever going to see in your lifetime. You need to go for this. 3 cents an acre. Can you imagine? I mean, some of it's, probably crappy land, but most of it's not. 3 cents an acre. So we do end up purchasing it. Now, you all know what happened with Katrina, right?
Yeah.
Well, have you seen this? Or did you know this? The White House announced today that Bush has successfully sold the state of Louisiana back to the French at more than double its original selling price of $11,250,000. This is a bold step forward for America, said Bush, and America will be stronger and better as a result. I stand here today in unity with French Prime Minister Jacques Chirac, who was so kind to accept my offer of Louisiana in exchange for $25 million cash. The state ravaged by Hurricane Katrina will cost hundreds of billions of dollars to rebuild.
After the hurricane?
Jack understands full well that this one's a fixer-upper, said Bush. He and the French people are quite prepared to pump out all that water and make Louisiana a decent place to live again. And they've got a lot of work to do, but Jack's assured me if it's not right, they're going to fix it. The move has been met with incredulity from the beleaguered residents of Louisiana. Shuba pie, said New Orleans resident Willis something. I don't even know what that next thing says. What does that say? Yum, dum, drab. I don't know what that means. However, President Bush's decision has been widely lauded by Republicans.
Is this serious? Like, really not right anymore? It has to be a joke.
This is an unexpected but brilliant move by the president, said Senate Majority Leader Bill Frist. Instead of spending billions and billions and billions of dollars rebuilding the state of Louisiana, we just made $25 million in pure profit. This is indeed a smart move, commented Fox analyst Britt Hume. Not only have we stopped the flooding in our own budget, we've made money on the deal. Plus, when the god-awful French are done fixing it up, we can easily invade it and take it back again. The money gained from the Louisiana refund is expected to be immediately pumped into the rebuilding of Iraq.
The Louisiana refund. Like, serious? This is a joke.
This came out in September of '05, which was, I think, shortly after Katrina, right?
Yeah. No.
Obviously, it didn't happen, but
It's really
it's pretty funny. But seriously, the Louisiana Purchase was huge in terms of what it did for our country, because what is Jefferson's vision for America? An agrarian nation, right? What do you need to have an agrarian nation? Land. So even though Jefferson struggled with whether or not this was constitutional, in many ways it was exactly what he would need in order to provide America with what they needed to achieve this vision, because he believed that America would be built on the backs of independent farmers who owned their own land. And in order to make that happen, you have to have land for them to be able to purchase. I mean, we obviously still had quite a bit of land, but this was going to just make it even that much easier for that to happen. Plus, it was really a great deal. Napoleon needed the money for what? He's fighting against Great Britain. Now, he had originally had designs on trying to rebuild an empire here, but he decided that he needed the money more at that point in time to be able to defeat Great Britain, which didn't happen, so we don't know what would have taken place if he had been successful in defeating Great Britain. But Napoleon, as we all know, made some serious, I mean, he's a great military general, but he made some serious blunders, which seems like fellow generals after the fact did not learn from. You know, invading Russia in the middle of winter, not a smart move. Hitler said, okay, we won't do it in the wintertime, we'll start on June 22nd to invade Russia, thinking that the Russians are so stupid and blunderous that they'll just fall flat on their face and we'll be out of here before the end of the summer. Didn't work that way. Hitler gets stuck, not Hitler personally, but his armies get stuck in Russia in the middle of winter, basically never to be found again. So not smart. If you're going to invade Russia, you need to be able to do it in the summer, spring and summer, and you need to do it quickly so that you're back out of there before the snow begins to hit. So if you ever have any designs on Russia, just keep that in mind. It's a reference. But Napoleon obviously was not successful in his plans to take over the world, or whatever exactly he was trying to do. But that left us with a great deal, because we ended up with the Louisiana Purchase, which doubled the size of our country. Third major thing in Jefferson's presidency is what? Marbury versus Madison. I mean, obviously not everybody would agree with me, because I'm picking three things that I think are important. Marbury versus Madison, Louisiana Purchase, and sort of. Except he wasn't in office in 1812. But you're absolutely right, Ed. The beginnings of what that's going to lead to the War of 1812 begins to happen under Jefferson's presidency. So what's happening that's going to lead us into the War of 1812?
Impressments.
Impressments. Okay? That doesn't sound like such a bad thing. You want to impress somebody? You know, that's a good thing, right? Wear your nice clothes, comb your hair, take a bath, put on deodorant. Is that what impressment means?
Pass it like charged dealerships.
Who was doing it? Who was doing the impressing? Mainly Great Britain. I mean, France was doing what you said. What did you say?
The attack of our ships.
Yeah. Both France and Britain were stopping our ships that were sailing on the high seas, that were trading and stuff like that. Both of them were stopping those ships. Why?
And they weren't trading with their enemies.
Yeah, they don't want us to trade with the other side. So they're stopping our ships and taking our stuff and keeping us from being able to trade openly with either country. So we're not happy with either one of them for doing that. But again, what kind of military do we have?
Not a very good one. Got some benchmarks.
Especially after Jefferson.
What had Jefferson done?
25 ships to 7.
He reduced our Navy from 25 ships to 7. 7. That's our Navy. 7 ships. Not, you know how you look at charts and it'll say have like 7, but then at the bottom it says, add 6 zeros to this number or something? No zeros, just 7. Okay, so our Navy has 7 ships and our Army has how many men?
Yeah, 3.5.
Somewhere between 2,500 and 3,500. Maybe he needed ships that would just hold the number of men we had. No. That's not a national military. Now, why did he do that? Was he trying to make us a weak nation?
You want us at cost. You want us weaken Central.
Okay, before that, what? Yeah, he wants to lower the cost of the government. He doesn't think government has to be big. He's trying to reduce our expenses and reduce the deficit, the national debt that Hamilton had created. And he said he believes in a weaker central government. He is more for the states having the power, not the central government. So he doesn't necessarily think you need a major national military because you have your state militias. So all of this comes out of his political philosophy of smaller government, weaker national government, give more power to the states. I mean, he doesn't want a weak country. He just thinks the power can come from the states as opposed to the national government. But when it comes to a situation like this, how do you go after countries that are attacking your ships when you only have 7 ships and you only have 3,000? We don't really have a Navy. We just have 7 ships. I mean, obviously there's some people that are on this, but it's not like we have thousands of people in the Navy. And then our Army is only 2,500, 3,000. How do you actually do anything if somebody's attacking you? So Jefferson decides that he can't really attack them militarily, so what's his response going to be? An embargo. Now what's an embargo? Okay. Well, an embargo generally means that you won't import from that person's country any longer. Now we bought most of our stuff from Great Britain at this point in time because they're the biggest manufacturer in the world. So the idea, you would think, would just be that we're not going to purchase anything from Great Britain any longer. But was this embargo just that?
No, stop shipping over here too.
And where else?
France.
And where else?
All of Europe is everywhere.
Basically, Americans play amongst yourselves. Because you don't get to trade with anybody else. We're going to stop all foreign trade. We're only going to trade with ourselves. Now, the plan was that, obviously, we all know that's not a good idea in the sense that if you do that for very long, it's not going to be very helpful. But the idea was to make it as, well, what's going to happen is if we say you can trade with these 5 countries, what are Americans going to do?
Pretend like that's what we're doing.
And still trade with Great Britain, right? Because we never do what the government tells us. I mean, the government has seen us smuggle and seen us sell to the enemy in every war we've ever been in. So the government can't trust the American people to really not trade with the enemy. So they say, you're not going to get to trade with anybody. And if we do that, very quickly, Great Britain is going to feel the pinch. And they're going to say, okay, guys, we're going to stop doing this. Now, I forgot to say, what is impressment, though? Not just attacking the ships, but capturing our soldiers, taking them off of our 7 ships. These are trading ships, but taking them off of our ships and forcing them into the British Navy, impressing them, because an impress is like forcing something. So you're forcing them to work in the British Navy, which apparently was like the most horrible job in all the world. It would go on TV on, what is that show? 30 Jobs or something. It would be the worst job. Nobody wanted to be in the British Navy. That's why the British had to keep stealing other people's men, because they couldn't get any of their men to do it. So they would take our men and force them to work on their ships. And, when you're out at sea and you're on a ship, what are you going to do? Jump? I mean, you're kind of stuck. You might as well go ahead and do what they tell you to do. So that's what Great Britain was doing. Both Britain and France were stopping our ships and stealing our merchandise. And so we're trying to get them to stop doing that. And Jefferson's plan is this embargo. Now he knows it's going to hurt American shipping, but he's hoping that it'll be such a short-term thing and Britain will cave and then we'll be back to everything being fine again. But they don't cave as quickly as we would like. And this embargo has what impact? Pretty serious economic impact on us. And obviously people are going to start complaining because they're losing money. And so there's a lot of resistance and a lot of complaining toward the government. You need to fix this. This is ridiculous that you're hurting our businesses like this. But it's 1807. And then it's now 1808. And what happens in 1808? New election. Jefferson's already served 2 terms. He's not running in 1808. So who becomes president in 1808? James Madison, who was Jefferson's Secretary of State. Now he's president. Madison inherits the situation where the economy is going down the toilet. Everybody's mad at the presidency. He's only 5'4" and weighs 100 pounds. He's afraid they're going to beat him up. Okay, maybe not, but he really is only 5'4" and weighs 100 pounds. That's not a lie. Can you imagine? President of the United States, 5'4" and weighs 100 pounds. You can just punt him into the neighbor's yard. I just can't even, it's like weird that somebody, can you imagine today us electing a president that was 5'4" and weighed 100 pounds?
Wasn't Napoleon time?
Yeah, wasn't he like
Yeah, he was
Yeah,
we elected a president in a wheelchair, so.
We did.
Yeah, but we didn't know that. Who said that? Did you say that? We didn't know that. Because every time he did a public presentation, he stood up. Sort of.
We're sitting.
They propped him up. But he always tried to appear in public as much as possible standing because he didn't want the American people to think he was, infirmed or anything. It's just the image that we have of men today. Whether we like it or not, we still have this image that men are supposed to be tall and strong and, all that kind of stuff. And the idea that we would have a little tiny, wimpy-looking president just seems weird. Because, even Washington was huge for his time period. He was 6'2", but that was really tall for that time period. Most guys weren't over 6 feet tall at all, but they weren't also 5'4" and 100 pounds. So Madison takes over, and he's now president, but he's inherited this situation. Now everybody hates him just because he's in the office. He hasn't even done anything yet. He has to figure out a way to deal with this situation. And at first, he doesn't go to war or anything like people were saying we should. He tries some different plans, which are, okay, we can trade with everybody except Britain and France. So open it up to all these other countries, but we're not going to trade with those 2 countries. But then the next thing that he said was, kind of like he's putting the carrot out there, in front of the horse. He says, if either one of you, Britain or France, will come to me and say that you'll stop doing this, then we will reopen trade with you, but we'll continue the boycott against the other country. So who comes running? Napoleon. He's not stupid. He's crazy, but he's not stupid. So he comes running and says, oh, yeah, we'll do that. You just keep that boycott against Great Britain, but, open trade with us. Well, of course, he does that, and then they continue to stop our ships. But he's created the problem because now Britain is mad at us because we have, in a sense, allied with the French again. And they continue to do this, and they continue to, take our men and stuff, and things don't get better as quickly as people in America would like. And more people start to call for war. And so the next thing you know, we are declaring war against Great Britain. Now, when we declared war, remember, it takes 3 or 4 weeks before word gets across the ocean. We declared war, and very shortly after that, I forget how many days, word came back from Great Britain that they were caving and that they were willing to back down and start to trade with us again. But it was too late because they crossed each other on the ocean. And so we started making preparations for war. So the War of 1812 is us against Great Britain again, only 20 years 30 years later, 30 years after our American Revolution. So we're fighting against Great Britain again. If we lose, we become a British colony all over again. And the thing is, we should have lost. Because we didn't have an army or a navy. We didn't have a military that could fight against, again, the greatest military in the world at that time. I mean, what were we thinking? Where was Washington? Oh, he was dead by then. I mean, if Washington had still been alive, I'm sure he would have said, "Are you guys nuts? What do you think you're doing?" And how many of you speak with a British accent? I mean, naturally. Not necessarily trying to pick up girls. Why do we not speak with a British accent? Why did we win? It doesn't make any sense. This is not a war we should have won, but we shouldn't have won the Revolutionary War either. Let me check something. I think this is probably too long. But show you this. What am I doing? Anyway, the War of 1812, just in these last few minutes that we have. What are your questions? All right, the War of 1812 was your last question. So for those of you that are N through Z, right, you had that question?
No, the other way around.
The other way around. Okay, A through M had that question. Did you notice I flipped that on you guys?
Yeah.
So why is that war, I mean, we did win. Why is that war so important in American history?
Because there are little things after that. We still remember today, like the press has got to keep those stars and banner, now the national anthem.
But
We
that,
also added 7 minutes.
what?
We also added the minutes.
Well, you're absolutely correct on what you just said, but in terms of the actual winning of the war, I mean, he talked about the Star Spangled Banner, and that, you know, is one of the most memorable things that comes out of the War of 1812. I mean, most of us know the Star Spangled Banner, or at least we can hum along or something. But that was originally a poem that was written during the War of 1812. It was later put to music, and then it didn't become our national anthem until 1931. So it was around for a long time before we actually made it our national anthem. But in terms of the military, I guess, significance of this war, why is it so important? Anybody else? Okay, that's one of the significance, because Andrew Jackson becomes a war hero because of his, specifically his efforts at the Battle of New Orleans, which was the most important battle in some ways of the war. The only problem was it actually happened. The war was already over with, but we didn't know again because it takes so long for word to get back. So that battle took place after we'd already signed the peace treaty. But still, it makes Andrew Jackson this great war hero because he captures a large British army, and, you know, that always looks good to us. So, other consequences is we realized that we needed a bigger military. We were going to need more of an army, more of a navy. So that's another consequence of this war, which we did after that. We began to create a larger standing army and navy. What else? Got rid of the Spanish. That's good. They were always kind of hanging out there, you know. It was like finally sort of put that to rest. Definitely America. See, all of this time, even when we defeated the British, everybody kind of figured it was just because the British gave up. They didn't really think we defeated them. Or if they did think we defeated them, it was because we had the help of the French. So it was never like anybody really respected us as a true nation. We were still being treated like sort of second cousins, or, you know, second cousins 3 times removed or something. So, what?
Redheaded stepchild.
Yeah, exactly. So, This particular war causes the rest of the world to have to kind of take notice that maybe we are a power to be reckoned with, that we have to be treated as, you know, an equal, at least somewhat of an equal to the rest of the nations of the world. Anything else?
Also, the citizens of the country have respect for the government, faith in the country itself.
He said that the citizens began to have more respect for the country. I think it's definitely a unifying feature, that just as that article by George Will said that we still kind of had a Articles of Confederation mentality, after the War of 1812, we do begin to act more like a nation, that we see ourselves as connected with those other states. It's no longer however many individual states that we had at that time, but it really is more of a nation. The last statement I'd like to make about the War of 1812, and this is kind of the way I would sum that up, is it's often